Mr. Koskinen, your reputation as a strong manager precedes you, and I look forward to having you bring those skills to bear on an agency that has some very significant challenges and significant tasks. You write in your testimony, I don't know any organization in my 20 years of experience in the private sector that has said, I think I'll take my revenue operation and starve it for funds to see how it does. And you also reference a recent Inspector General's report which found that $1 billion in budgetary savings from the IRS has actually cost the Treasury $8 billion in compliance revenues. So my question is, would you say that increase revenues, you could increase revenues by having the budgetary appropriations that existed and thus be able to actually either use those revenues for deficit reduction or critical programs that we are dealing with right now by ensuring the IRS has the funds available to accomplish its mission?
I think the historic record would demonstrate that, Senator. As a general matter, the IRS budget has been in the range of $12 billion. The compliance revenues alone, which are the revenues received as a result of IRS actions pursuing taxpayers, have generated between $50 and $60 billion a year. So historically, the ratio of expenditures for the entire budget of the IRS compared to the revenues generated by their activities has been 4 or 5 to 1. The IG report noted that the more recent impact has been an 8 to 1 ratio. So I think while the IRS does not need unlimited funds and does not need substantial funds compared to the entire budget, the President's budget for 2014 provided a budget of $12.8 billion for the IRS. It's presently operating on an assumption of $11.2 billion. That difference is a substantial and significant one. If the funds were made available to the IRS, I'm confident that more than the additional revenues provided to the IRS would be returned to the government in additional tax collections and revenues.
Well, whether your recognition of historical 4 or 5 to 1 or the Inspector General's suggestion of 8 to 1, that's a ratio that people would be willing to invest in any given time, it seems to me. And it seems to me one that we should certainly consider. It's a great way, as we are dealing with the challenges of both budgetary and deficit reduction, to try to achieve that. Let me ask you a different question and a more specific issue. When the Finance Committee imposed a fee on branded prescription drugs during the creation of the Affordable Care Act, we made sure to exclude drugs used to specifically treat what we call orphan diseases. The intent was to protect the current incentives in law which encourage innovation in the development of treatments for rare diseases, a goal of which I believe just about every colleague on this committee would share. The ACA says, and I quote, "Branded prescription drugs shall not include sales of any drug or biological product with respect to which a credit was allowed for any taxable year under Section 45C, which is the section of the tax code that defines what the orphan drug tax credit is." In its temporary rule, however, the IRS has interpreted this orphan drug exemption as only applying to drugs that were allowed and granted the orphan drug credit, rather than to all orphan drugs as designated by the FDA. Now, I can tell you, as a member of the committee during the drafting of the law, we intended to exclude all drugs whose designs serve the critical purposes laid out in the eligibility for the orphan drug credit, not just for those drugs for which the paperwork was filled out to claim the credit. There may be reasons why a company may or may not choose to claim the credit, but they, in fact, were allowed that credit. So since not all makers of FDA-designated orphan drugs apply for and receive the discretionary credit, the result is that now some orphan drugs are going to be subject to the fee, even though Congress clearly intended to exempt all orphan drugs. So my question is, knowing that congressional intent was to exempt orphan drugs from the Affordable Care Act's branded drug fee in order to encourage manufacturers to develop treatments for rare diseases, do you believe that using a definition of the organ drug exemption would allow the full spectrum of FDA-designated orphan drugs to be eligible for the exemption, which would be more in line with the congressional intent than the current definition, which arbitrarily excludes those who are eligible and are allowable, but didn't just claim it?
Senator, I was not aware until you raised this issue of that particular question under the Affordable Care Act.
Well, this is commonly known.
But
I'm kidding. I'm just kidding.
no remorse. Certainly, if confirmed, if I'm Commissioner, I would be delighted to work with you and get back to you and discuss what the possibilities are to make sure that the congressional intent is followed. As I say, I'm not familiar with the details of the regulation and the thinking behind it, but I would be pleased to talk with you further about it.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me close, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, our intent was to make sure that those drugs that, but for, the treatment as we gave it under the code and avoiding the new fee under the Affordable Care Act, is to create the opportunity for those drugs to be available for rare diseases where, in fact, the universe that will use it is not as great as other drugs that will maybe be used very commonly. And unless there is that incentive, then there will be no incentive to create the drugs, and people who have rare diseases and critically needed will not have access to it. And so I hope we can work on that together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.